Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'm just going to like to acknowledge that the land we identify as RTO 9 is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples. RTO 9 and the Indigenous Tourism Ontario honor and respect the land, the people, and the treaties. We are extremely thankful for the original tour guides of these lands and all that they have shared. All those that reside, work, and play on these lands are treaty people, and we must honor the treaties in a mutually beneficial manner. With 1 in 5 Indigenous peoples in Canada living in Ontario, we believe working together is a mutually beneficial manner will help all Ontarians prosper through the joint development of the tourism industry. Ontario is home to one of the largest Indigenous tourism industries in Canada. RTO 9 and ITO are pleased to be working side by side together under an MOU to help advance the Indigenous tourism industry in Ontario. As an ally to Indigenous people and a partner of Indigenous Tourism Ontario, RTO 9 will commit to improving the socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous people through tourism by creating a space for Indigenous people to tell their stories on their terms. And just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's session. First, this workshop is being recorded and will be available for viewing after today's session on the RTO 9 website, which is just rto9.ca. There will be a question period at the end, and Adrienne has said if you have questions while the presentations are going on, please feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A box, which in the Q&A box, it can be done anonymously. They're both at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as they come in. You will receive an email following today's session as well. It's just going to have a quick 2-minute survey in there. If you're able to spend some time and review the session, we greatly appreciate that. And then without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to our lovely facilitator this morning, Adrienne Carter.
Thank you, Meg. Welcome, everybody. I will start by sharing my screen. We'll do that. Okay, that looks good. We're all set. All right. Okay, welcome. This session is specifically for not-for-profit corporations. And so I was actually going to call it Do What You're Told, because what we find most often is grants applications fail simply because you don't follow the instructions. Yeah, it's really about following the instructions very clearly and concisely. So I'm going to start this morning with talking about a glossary of terms, just because there's a lot of terms out in the world, in the granting world, and things mean slightly different nuances depending on the granting body you're talking to. So generally, grants mean that money will be given to an organization with no requirement for repayment. It's funny, FedDev Ontario considers a grant to be money given without requirement for payment or reporting. I have never known a grant that does not require reporting. You always have to say how you spent the money in the end. And we'll get to that as we go through this process. So a grant is different than a loan. A loan requires that you repay that with or without interest, depending on if you're a government body or a bank or private corporation lending the money. Donations are simply, they're donated. There's no reporting or repayment required to give the money back. And then, so this is where we get into federal terminology. You'll come across in federal grants, non-repayable contributions. That is their term for a grant. It means that you're going to enter into a contribution agreement, and it will either be non-repayable or it will be repayable. Usually for not-for-profits, those are non-repayable contributions, and they don't usually require matching dollars. When you go into the for-profit world, then it is often a repayable contribution, and it often has to be matched dollars. But the repayable portion, it's only usually a portion of what was granted in the first place. So that's why when you come across federal grants, you won't see the word grant, you'll see contribution instead. And then in our world at RTOs, we deal with the provincial government, and they enter into an agreement with any granting organization that they're giving money to, and they call that a transfer payment agreement. So you might often hear the expression a TPA, and that's what that is. It's essentially the agreement that the government's going to give you money, and this is what you've agreed to do with it. So as you work through grants, whether it's with the RTO 9 or any provincial grant or any level of grant for that matter, whether it's municipal or federal, you'll hear terms like partnership, co-applicant, collaborator, all these kind of things. And each body kind of has their own nuances about what that means. But a partnership really is entering into a granting agreement where all parties contribute to the project. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the partner that you're entering a project with actually is named as a co-applicant on the application, because that's something different. You can say, I have a partnership with the not-for-profit next door, the business next door, and they're going to help me with this project, but they're not coming on as a co-applicant, because when you come on as a co-applicant, now you have essentially two organizations that need to provide all the information that's required. So usually an application, well, most applications require organizational information about that organization. So your business number, your board information, your financial situation, all that kind of stuff. When you bring in a co-applicant, that means both organizations need to supply all that kind of information. So people tend to avoid that because it's essentially doubling your workload. And instead you say, I'm the lead organization, I'm going to be submitting that application, but I have these partners who are going to help me with this project, and this is what they're going to do, without having to go into all the business side of the partners that you're working with. So another term that you're going to come across is called stacking funds. What this means is you'll either be told that you can or you cannot stack funds. And what this means is often grants, especially from governments, will say that, we're going to say your project's $10,000 and we're going to fund 80% of it. So where's the other 20% coming from? Well, it can't, the 20% has to come from the organization. But sometimes governments will say, well, you can get that 20% from another grant, but it can't be the same body that's giving you that. So you'll see in the RTO 9's instructions as well, that because we are funded provincially, you can't take other provincial grant money and use it for your 20%. But you could take federal money or municipal money and use that for your 20%. Now, there are some grants that say you can only stack government funding up to 80%. So the federal government's going to give you 30, the provincial government's going to give you 30, and the municipal government's going to give you 20. You're going to have to come up with the last 20. So that's what it means to be able to stack funds. It used to be in the past that you could not, they didn't want you to stack funds at all, but now the most government bodies say yes, you can stack funds, but again, you cannot stack the same level of government with that same level of government. So provincial dollars can't be matched with provincial dollars. That's essentially left pocket, right pocket. So we can't do that. There is a difference between key performance indicators, or as we call them in the RTO world, performance measurements, They are the quantitative measurements of how you're going to achieve, or how are you going to measure whether your project was a success or not. Kind of did this a little backwards. What comes first, of course, are your goals or your objectives. These are the qualitative targets. The pie in the sky, I want to do this certain thing with this project, and it's, you know, maybe I want to revive the cultural activity that happens in our community. I want to make that come alive again. Well, the qualitative measurements of that, the performance indicators will be, we want 10,000 people to show up at our newly revamped event. So there's got to be a number associated with performance indicators, because you've got to say whether you met that target or not. So that's the difference. You have these measurements that require a number, a quantitative number, and then you have goals that are qualitative. And usually what happens is you have about 3 goals and you have 3 measurements to fit those goals. And then everybody knows whether your project was successful or not. Some tourism terms here. You have a DMO, which is Destination Management Organization. These guys are usually your municipal visitor center. They are often run through a municipality. Sometimes they're their own not-for-profit entity, but that really depends on the municipality that you're in. And then you have, in Ontario, we have these regional tourism organizations. Now, there were 13 of them set up in the province about 12 years ago. And so each region has several DMOs in their space that they work together and they collaborate efforts and really kind of boost tourism at a regional level. As the rising tide floats all boats is kind of idea there. So one of the very first things you're going to have to get organized before you even look at grants is the structure of your organization. You will most likely need to be incorporated. Not always, but most likely. There is the exception to Indigenous businesses, and Indigenous businesses is defined as being at least 51% owned and operated by an Indigenous person. And because of treaties and the Indian Act, most Indigenous businesses are not incorporated because they come under different rules of engagement with the federal government. So there is that exception for Indigenous businesses. You don't necessarily need to be incorporated. And then sometimes granting bodies want to make sure you have a CRA business number. The two are not the same. Okay, your organization is going to be incorporated and it's going to have a shorter number. It's usually 5 or 7 numbers. And then the CRA business number essentially allows you to file your HST rebates, your taxes, if you do payroll, anything like that, anything that requires tax implications, then you're going to need a business number. And that is usually a 9-digit number, and it often ends with RT001 or RP001, depending on what the tax bracket is that you're trying to utilize. Often for not-for-profits, most grants are going to want to know that you have proper insurance, general liability insurance, business and board insurance. It's usually in the range of $2 million, and that's kind of standard these days. As a not-for-profit, they're also going to want to see your organizational chart and who's on your board. And then just to have them handy, because they're going to ask you, you know, what does your organization do? If you can have your mandate, values, missions, all that kind of stuff sorted and organized, then you can answer those questions fairly quickly. When I say the mandate is what need does the organization serve? Does it provide a safe space for artists? As an example, for me, I work at the Three Sisters Cultural Center in St. Jacobs. So our mandate is that we provide a safe space for artists. So the values then are, what are the sensibilities that the organization operates under? For us, everybody is welcome. So our mission then is about how will the organization meet that need. And so for us, we operate a cultural center. And then you have your vision and where do you want to be in 5 years? Usually the vision and the goals are more 3 to 5 year horizons. And so for us, we want to be a place where artists are thriving. And finally, goals are those actionable plans to get you there. And then, of course, you have measurements, as I mentioned, to see whether you actually obtain those goals. So for us, we wanted to have new studio space offered to artists and develop art experiences. So if you go through that and make sure all that is organized, and when you come to go answer grants and their questions, you can come up with the answers fairly quickly. It's also a good idea to have prepared a business plan, which is an annual thing. And of course, as a not-for-profit, it is pricey, but it is very well worth it to get audited financial statements and then do up annual reports. All of this tells the granting body that you are organized, you know what you're doing, and you're serious about what you're doing, that this isn't a fly-by-night kind of setup, that it will give the granting body confidence that you will do what you say you're going to do and you will complete the project as promised. So now you need to figure out what your granting needs are, because grants come up quickly. But then again, they also have very long horizons. They can be both. So if you plan out your next 2 or 3 years, where you list all the projects that you want to do and you establish the timelines and the rough budgets, then you're ready to go when a grant comes up and says, oh, you've got a month to fill out the application, which sounds like a long time. It's not. So, but then, I filled out a grant just a couple of weeks ago, and it was literally for the next 2 years. It doesn't come into effect until 2025. So I had to know what I was going to do in 2 years' time. The grant searching is often the biggest job. You have to do it continuously and well in advance to find the grants that fit your projects and adapt to and your needs. And you can often adapt your project to fit the grants. So it might be as simple as changing when the event happens, because a lot of grants will say you must be done by March 31st, because that's the fiscal year for the government body. Or municipal bodies run on calendar year, so they might have different timelines. RTO 9 has 2 intake dates, so there's times around when you can apply for when your project's going to actually take place. So there's ways you can maybe add an element to your grant to fit the mandate of the ask. That happens as well. You can always change things up a little bit. So a government grant, whether it's provincial, federal, municipal, they often require registration. And just before we got on the call, I was updating my Grants Ontario platform. They're updating their system, so we all have to re-register because they've gone into a new platform for their granting system. So that might take a while. I know the Trillium Foundation has quite a rigorous registration process, and it can take a week. So if you leave your grant application to the final week of the due date, then that's not going to work, because you have to go through the registration process first. If you're going to go down the road of private grants, I would start locally. I would start with corporate foundations that are local in your community, and they tend to have a mandate to support local endeavors, certainly for not-for-profits. And then that would just start to get the ball rolling for your. Essentially, you're trying to build a resume as a good grant operator, right? That you fill out nice applications, you do what you say you're going to do, and you do the final report. And that gives the next grantor confidence that that their money is going to be spent wisely and as intended. So of course, the very first thing you want to look at before you go down the road of writing all the content for an application is, are you eligible? It might just be a simple yes or no when you look at the organizational requirements. And this depends on how the organization is structured. So a lot of grants will say you must be a not-for-profit, you must be in existence for 3 years, you must have an operating budget of more than $75,000. So these are yes or no questions that you can quickly answer before you start wasting your time on a grant that you're not even eligible to apply for. And then you look at your projects. Does your project meet the requirements of the grant, of what you can spend the money on? Usually, well, for a program grant, you can't spend it on capital acquisitions, those kind of things. So most grants will not allow you to spend their money on insurance, on normal operating costs, fundraising. They don't want you to take the grant and then go and try and raise money with the money you got from the grant. So there's all these little nuances that you just need to be aware of and stick to it. It's very important that you don't spend the money as you should not, because every granting body has the right to request the funds back. So you want to make sure that you follow the rules as they are laid out and quite clear. Yeah, and then your program priorities. Now these are most granting bodies will have several grants that they will put out throughout the year, and each one will have their own program priorities. What is their goal? And in giving out this money, and your project goal needs to make their priorities be fulfilled. So it's often, yeah, so you're going to tweak your project a little bit to fit the priorities of the grant that you're applying for. And when you go and answer all the questions, you make sure that you address their priorities each and every time in each of those questions that they ask you. What you will often find in grants is that they will ask you what seems like the same question 5 times. Well, so it becomes an art of being able to answer those questions in different ways without repeating yourself, but always going back to what is the granting body's priorities, because you're essentially selling yourself to this organization and how you're going to help them meet their goals. And that's really the sales pitch. So this is where I come to do what you're told. Carefully follow all the instructions. Deadlines matter. They are absolutely essential. When the grant says it closes at 5 p.m. on Friday, it closes at 5 p.m. on Friday. Not at 5:01, not on Saturday morning, not the first thing Monday. The deadlines are hard, and to the point that you won't even be able to submit your application because they're done online most of the case these days. And so that, yeah, there is no leeway for deadlines to submit grants. And a lot of this seems very simple, but it's amazing how often it gets missed. Just answer all the questions. Make sure that all those boxes are filled out. What you will actually find in provincial grants from Ontario is that there's a little verification button at the top, and it will, as you fill out the fillable PDF, and it will make sure that you are that you filled out all the boxes that they need filled out. And if you don't meet the verification, then they say, well, you can't submit this, you're missing this piece of information. So that kind of thing is helpful in case you miss one little box or one little tick. But yes, it's really important to make sure all the questions are answered in the best way you can. And that you also submit all the supporting documents that they want. They will usually want financial statements from the past few years. They might want your business plan, an annual report. They might want letters of support or quotes, really whatever they're asking for. You have to make sure that you're actually supplying those documents. And the biggest thing that gets people in trouble is not submitting a balanced budget. where you really want to make sure that your revenues match your expenses, and all these line items that you put in your budget actually reflect what you have put in the narrative of what this project is about in the grant. So the reviewer of the grant can easily see, okay, the person wants to do such and such with this project, and that is clearly reflected in the budget, that the budget doesn't have things that shouldn't be there that don't relate to the project, or the budget is missing stuff that would be crucial to the budget, to the project. So you really be careful with that. But it's amazing how many people simply don't produce a balanced budget where they can show where all the revenue is coming from to match all the expenses that they anticipate this project will cost. So just simply putting in a balanced budget will be ahead of the game. So when a grant body says, well, we suggest or we recommend that you provide this kind of information or those kind of supporting documents, this is not a suggestion. It is not a recommendation. It is something that is going to get you into that review pile. So you need to stand up above the crowd, because there's always so many more grant applications than they have funds for. And so in order to make sure that you're actually reviewed, is to do everything that they recommend. To add all the extra information that they've wanted or they've suggested. If they suggest to partner with people, go and partner with people. It's really important that anything that they suggest, it's not a suggestion. Go and make sure you do that. So those are the general kind of what to look for when you go through the grant. I might just take a pause. Meg, is there any questions or anything that anybody would like to chime in?
No questions yet.
All right.
But good, valuable information.
Okay, I will continue then. So now we're getting into how do you go about writing a grant? You really need to create that elevator pitch. You need to be able to, sell your passion and the need for this project. What is not asked for, but is always looked for, is your commitment to this project. They don't want to hand you money that you're gonna then say, oh no, I don't feel like doing that anymore. So they really look for your passion. And so to be able to convey that in very strict character counts or line numbers, space counts, is quite a trick. It is the hardest thing to do, is to stay within the space provided for the grant. So you want to really stay focused on the question. As I said, always refer back to the grant priorities. And my advice is to often grants now are fillable PDFs, or they're actually done right online. Well, copy the questions, put them in a Word document, and then go and write out your answers. Don't be so concerned about the space or the length of it, and then you can start to refine your answer. You can take out a lot of repetitiveness, things like grammar tends to go out the door. You don't need the word the, just, and period. Well, that's an extra character count. So, sometimes it can get that tight, where you really need to say what you need to say without worrying about the character count, and then bring it back down to what it needs to be. Because if you try and answer these questions in the live document, you will simply stop being able to type. That's the system. The system has said you're allowed 2,000 characters, and that's it. When you get to 2,000 characters, you're done. So then I find it very hard to wordsmith that way. So that's why I do it in Word first. I massage the answers, and make sure it all sounds great and that I'm answering. Yes, it might seem like the same question over and over again, but there are nuances. So it's fairly important to stay, really read the question very carefully of what exactly are they asking in this particular question. And a good way to figure that out is to actually always refer back to the grant guidelines. There will always be guidelines with grants, and the guidelines will tell you what the grant priorities are. They might go down to each and every question. This is what we mean by this question. This is what we're looking for in this question. Make sure you hit those points. And yeah, if you're always referring back to the grant priorities and their mandate, then you'll have a better chance at being successful. Yeah, this is the hardest part of grant writing. I could write a grant in an hour, but it would then take me 3 days to get it down to the character count that it needs to be. So as it's noted in the RTO 9's verbiage about the partnership fund, less is more. You do not need to go on and on about you do have live people who are reading these things, and they've got a lot to read. So stick to the point and answer their questions concisely and clearly. So these are just a list of some of the grant supporting documents that you might be asked for. Letters of support, quotes for large budget items, and partner commitment letters. So if you're not a co-applicant and you just have partners, then you might need those commitment letters from them. So I'm actually going to switch things up, and I'm going to take you through the TREM model. So this is produced by the province of the Ministry of Tourism. And it essentially, it's a very simple way for you to go about figuring out the economic impact of your event. So if you simply Google TREM, TREIM, you'll come to this page. It'll be Ontario. You'll see it, Tourism Regional Economic Impact Model. So you want to use TREM. Come on. You need to agree to their terms. Most cases, because we're often doing tourism grants, and this really is for tourism grants, you want to know that economic impact. Though municipal grants will often ask you for it as well. So we go into visitor spending. Well, I don't know what each person's going to spend. I don't know what the total spending is going to be, but I do have an estimate of how many visitors are coming. So because this is the Ministry of Tourism, you can give it a, well, let's use there, just do that one. As you see, I do these all the time. So you have to give it a title. You have to say that you can do a census division, and that will be, a very specific area that you're living in. I actually suggest that you do the travel region, and then it'll show you all the RTOs, right? So, and that's how the Ministry of Tourism functions, is with these RTOs. So it's best to play in the same ballpark with them. So if we use RTO 9, we know that the activity is going to take place in this year. We do want household spending. We don't think anybody's going to actually invest in business because of our event, and we're not concerned about property tax. Okay, so then we just go to the next screen. We're going to anticipate, now this is where it gets a little nuanced, and if anybody's filling out a reconnect, or sorry, what are they called now? Experience Ontario is the grant this year. That is your used to be Reconnect, used to be Blockbuster. It is the grant for events and experiences, where the Ministry of Tourism will fund. Usually they're looking for a new activities that your event is doing, not just paying for, fencing and basic operations of an event. So what they're talking about here is the number of visitors from beyond 40 kilometers. They don't care about the community members who are living in your community that you're hosting the event. They want to know who's essentially going to be staying overnight or coming from afar, that they're going to need gas, they're going to need a meal, they might do some shopping. So it doesn't really matter what number you say. So let's say 10,000 people. The rest of Canada, of course, is people coming from outside of Ontario. Maybe that's 3,000 people. And then because we get a lot of people in from the States, because we're along the border, we might get 1,000 people coming from the US, and we'll be a little modest with the overseas. Now I'm going to take it that we're going to estimate that 80% of the visitors coming from beyond 40 kilometers are going to just be day trippers. And then so that leaves 20% will stay overnight. And our event is a weekend, so we're just going to take an average of one night. And then we're going to do the same for actually, so I'm going to actually take it because you're coming from out of province, you are going to stay overnight. So that'll be 100%. And maybe you're going to stay for 2 days. And the same with the States, though I think that might change. But anyway, this is just an example. And so you fill in these boxes. And this total does not include your community members. You might get another 30,000 people coming to your event, but they're all within the 40 kilometers of your space. So that TREM does not apply to that. So then you go to the next screen and you submit for calculation. It wants you to say okay to that. It takes a moment, but it's really this simple. And once you get your number, then when the question comes in the grant that says, what's the economic impact? It should be here. There we go. Yeah, you'll be able to say, well, according to TREM, based on these numbers, certainly in that Experience Ontario grant application, it actually lays it out like this. What were these numbers? What are these percentages? How did you get to this number? So I'm going to then be able to tell them, has to load, sorry. Usually not empty. There we go. So I can say that my little weekend event is going to have an economic impact of over $1.6 million. And then it breaks it down into more information. You don't usually need to go into this depth when filling out grant applications, or even the reporting for that matter. But this essentially tells you how they get to that calculation. And so yeah, then you've got numbers about the rest of the province and that kind of stuff. So the number that you're really looking for your grant application is the one right at the top. So it's that simple to get your TREM numbers for your economic impact. And because this is an entity that, sorry, let me do that again. Because it's the Ministry of Tourism has actually set up this TREM, then you know that what they're going to value the information, and it shows that you are using their tools that they have designed to help them assess activities. So it is important to use the ministers or the government bodies' own tools that they have to answer their questions, because it means that you're a good player. You're going to follow the rules that they've set out, and be, reporting as they're going to want to see it. So really important, don't leave all of this to the last minute. Like I said, some grantors require that you need to register first. That could take a few days, could take a week, could take a month. It doesn't usually take that long. And then if you need other pre-qualified information, other accreditations, you might need to get quotes, you might need to get partners in place and letters from the municipality to say, yeah, we agree with this. All of that can take time. And so it's so much easier if you have a plan of attack for the grants that are coming up. A lot of them, you will know when they're coming, what they're about, when they're due. And so you can plan well in advance so you're not going crazy in the last week that a grant is due. And I'm going to put out some advice that you start slow. If you're new to the granting world, find some smaller grants to start with. I recommend that you start by always applying for summer job placement. So there's two as Canadians that we can apply for that are easy. You have the summer experience program that the Ministry of, Employment puts out at the provincial level. And so that's the summer experience program. Then the federal government puts out the Canada Summer Jobs program, and that's at the federal level. And so they both have their own nuances of what they're looking for. SUP is really geared, well, we always do it geared towards tourism, because I think I was wrong. I think the Ministry of Tourism actually puts out SUP. So it's really to help with building up heritage sites that might need summer jobs and that kind of stuff. But these are easy grants to get. And they kind of build up your reputation that you are a successful grant recipient, that you do what you say you're going to do, and you do the reporting that's required, and everything's above board. So they're easy. And another little tip is I always use what I call the Scotty method from Star Trek, to promise and over deliver. So when you're doing those KPIs, and the experience grant will want very specific KPIs, measurements of how you're going to track attendance, website traffic, whatever it is. So always under promise. It's okay to not have a high number, but it's better to say, not only did I meet that target, but I exceeded it, rather than trying to say, oh, we're going to get very lofty ambitions here, and then you come short. Now, that being said, if you do come short of your target, that's okay. It's not a problem. Don't lie. Don't make stuff up. Just explain what happened. Why didn't you meet that target? As long as you're forthcoming and honest, it really doesn't matter. It's the fact that you tried, you filled out the boxes, you filled in the report, you gave the government back the information they need to close that project. And if it's a lesson learned for you as an organization, what not to do next time, great, then we're all satisfied. So, it's not the be all and end all if you don't actually make your KPIs, but do have a reason. What happened? Why didn't you meet them? And it can be anything. We lost staff, bad weather. It really can be any reason at all. COVID, I mean, things happen, right? So it's okay, but do answer the questions. Don't shirk them. Don't lie about them. And make sure you do actually fill out those final reports. Most grants nowadays have a holdback where they will only issue you a certain portion of the grant, and you will get the rest of the money when you fill out that final report. So what it does require is a not-for-profit that you have a bit of a buffer, that you have those funds that you can cover those costs, and be fine with it until the government says checks off the final report, and it can be several months after your project has finished. And the other thing is a not-for-profit, if you do have a CRA number, you're going to be getting all your HST money back, depending on how your organization is structured, but usually we get all our HST money back. So the government, when you put in your grant budgeting and in the final report or your claims, the federal government, FedDev, has claim forms that you have to submit every quarter, depending on the length of your grant. They won't cover the costs of HST because they know you're going to get it back in the end. So not only do you have to cover the 10% of the holdback or whatever the holdback is, but you also have to cover the 13% of the HST until you get that back when you file for your HST rebate. So as a not-for-profit, it makes it very difficult, but you have to do it. You have to find those extra funds to essentially float the grant until all the funds come in. And it's probably why organizations like the Ontario Council for the Arts, or the Ontario Arts Council, thank you. They actually, you need to exist for 3 years and have $75,000 operating budget, because then they know that you can cover those under, you know, the float that you're going to need. It really becomes a cash flow problem, but you know, and as you know, you can try and go to the bank and get a loan for the gap, and as long as you have a signed agreement with the government body, you could be successful at doing that to bridge that gap. That is always an option, but often I know for us in the RTO world, we have a cash flow gap at the beginning of every fiscal year, and we can't go to the bank and get a loan because we don't have a signed TPA. And as soon as we get the signed TPA, then we get our funds, and then we would qualify for a grant loan, bank loan. So there's nuances in there that don't work. But I think for, you know, certainly smaller operations and smaller not-for-profits, museums and that kind of thing, especially if you are functioning under a municipality, then perhaps a municipality can float the cash, and that kind of thing. So again, I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions? It's a lot of information before I move to the next phase.
I did have a question in the Q&A. You did touch briefly on it, but just as a refresher, what a KPI stands for.
Key performance indicators, or as the RTOs call them, performance measurements.
Perfect. And then I also had one just about the trend model when you were putting in numbers. They were just wondering if you were guessing at the numbers that you were putting in for like attendance, and what's the best way maybe to guesstimate how many people might show up at an event you're doing?
Yeah, so the numbers I just threw in there, like they were complete guesses. I would talk to your friends. So, you know, if you're running a little museum in a small community and you want to put on an event, well, what does the local service club do? That might be similar, that they might be able to share an event expectation on the size and the amount of people. Now, the other way to do it is if you know that last year we had 20,000 people come to our event, but I have no idea where they're coming from. So how do I do that model with, you know, Ontario, US, that kind of thing? RTO 9 will be a resource for you to get a hold of the Ministry of Tourism's, what do we call it, Meg? It's essentially a snapshot of tourism every year. And those documents from the Ministry of Tourism will say, on average, a percentage of the visitors are from within 40 kilometers, a percentage are from beyond 40 kilometers. We get a percentage of US visitors. So if you just use those percentages that the Ministry of Tourism provides in their reporting to the RTOs, then it's a good ballpark. You don't need to be exact with this. It is estimates. And it's nice to be able to then on your final report plug in the actual numbers. And so for the most part, running grants, running the projects that grants are funding, it's going to be very important that you have a baseline of information. So if one of your KPIs is I want to see a 5% increase on the traffic of my website, you better know what that first number was. What was the baseline? Where are you going from? How do you know what the increase is going to be? I run into so many people who, through partnership funding, who say, yeah, I want an increase. And then it comes to the reporting and they never actually took the baseline. So how do we know that you got an increase? So doing those baseline numbers, taking surveys at your event, or even doing online surveys through a social media channel to just kind of get a ballpark idea of how many people are coming from beyond 40 kilometers to your specific event. And does that align with what the province is seeing as a whole? So you make the guesses based on what the province provides at the onset, and then you can, if you do your surveying during your event, you can then have a final report that is more true to actuals. And then when you go into applying for a grant the following year, now you've got some actuals to base your information on, because Experience Ontario will ask you, how did you come up with these numbers? And that's what you can say. You say, well, I know that a similar event down the road had X amount of people, and so we're basing our numbers off of that. And because the ministry tells me that a certain percentage are from the states, this is what we're using, and that's fine. That's an answer, so that will work.
I also just had one come in, but you may touch on this further in your presentation, just about where to search for available grants, but you might be addressing that later.
I guess I can. I can do it now before we get into the next phase, is to actually talk about the RTO9's partnership fund. So I was going to provide a slide of lists of grants, but there's umpteen of them. There's so many. So all I started to do was search Grants Ontario, and you'll come to, I can actually show you. And it really depends on what your industry is and where you want to go, or what do you want to do, and how are you going to go about doing it? Where do you exist? So let me just share this so people can see what I'm doing. Okay. So yeah, if you just do available funding from the Ontario government, right? So it's just that easy. And now you can look, and this is why I didn't bother putting down a list, because there's so many opportunities, depending on what you are, or what is your organization's mandate. So now, if you register, and I can't go into my account right now because I have to do this new setup, but register for a Transfer Payment Ontario account, get in there, and then as you go through that, there will be, what are the current grants available with the ministry, with the Ontario government, and it can go across lots of ministries, not just tourism, but you'll have ones from education, from agriculture, small business. There's lots of them in there, forestry, mining, there's lots of grants in there. So your first step is to get an account with the transfer payment organization with that platform. So if you do Canada grants, this one's a little bit simpler. Most government grants don't need you to register or apply on a platform, they're actually going to want you to fill out a fillable PDF and email it to some office, depending on what you're doing. So if I'm going to do arts, culture, and sport, I'm going to continue. It's then going to start to list them all. And that's why I didn't bother, because there's a gazillion of them. Some are, the building communities through arts and heritage is a very tough one to crack, to get into. And it does festival events and projects. But then you've got the Canada Cultural Spaces. This is actually for capital builds, history, media, music. There is an actual program specifically for activities. Yes, Celebrate Canada. Those are the ones that are around. We're coming up to that time. It's going to be that June 21st to July 4th space. So it includes Indigenous Peoples Day, St. Jean-Baptiste Day, Canada Day, all these activities that happen in the next 2 weeks. So they have a specific grant for that. But yeah, I mean, that's only the C's, right? So it goes and goes and goes. So there's so much, and that's why it takes quite a bit of research to do. Now there are entities that will do grant writing for you, will do grant searches for you, but they're going to charge you for that. So if you have funds, great, you can do that. Because there are so many to deal with, it's hard to keep up, really, quite honestly. It does require maybe not a full-time job, but you could certainly have a dedicated staff person just monitoring what grants are available. So it might be worthwhile to look at specific granting bodies that might assist you with that. I think there's a few in Canada. There is also BDO, which is a business development organization. And they're actually tax people, but they will have forms for you, to like templates for making business plans, annual reports, your organizational chart, all the things that you might need for a grant. But yeah, I did write it. Let me just give me a second. Yeah, so I do recommend register with Grant Ontario. Yeah, there's lots of Canada business grants. Those are for the, oh yes, this is the one. It's called the Ontario Grant Watch. Now they do charge, they have a fee, but they will keep, you tell them what you're all about and what you're after, and they will, they'll keep an eye on grants for you and tell you when the next grant is. And I'm sure that if I went down that rabbit hole and actually started to pay them, they would also offer grant writing assistance as well. And sorry, the organization is BDC, not BDO. And BDC is a great resource if you've not done a business plan. They have a lovely templates that are downloadable. There's no cost to that. Yeah, it's there's just so many. It's really just a Google search on what you're looking for.
And you're good to go ahead with the rest of your presentation. Thank you, Adrienne.
Okay, all right. So I'm just going to discuss a little bit about the RTO9's partnership fund in particular, because they do have another intake in early July 3rd to the 21st. They'll be taking applications. And you see the list of the operators that they assist in building their tourism business. Because RTO is in the business of tourism, these grants need to fit that mandate. And so you need to be incorporated or at least have a business number. If you're an Indigenous business, then like I said, you might not have that incorporated number. That's okay. You can still apply. RTO 9 does not actually fund any of the DMOs, BIA, lovely acronyms, Chamber of Commerce, municipalities. Their grant is really for the small operators. But they do require that you have a letter of support from your DMO, from your visitor center. So your municipal destination management organization. It's usually your visitor center, but you can go through your municipal website, ask the RTO who the DMO would be for your area, and they could probably put you in contact with a person to get that letter. And then, like most other grants, they're going to want you to have a $2 million general liability insurance for your business. And that you actually name RTO 9 on the insurance policy if and when you get a grant for the duration of the project that you're going to be working on. And they have an application process, which I can show you here. So you get. So this is the RTO 9's actual application. It's a fillable PDF. Even though they say, just keep it to 8 pages, you can't fill in more than what this box allows. So this is where it comes in handy to answer those questions in Word and then cut and paste to make sure it fits. And so you want, other than the boilerplate business information, they're going to want your project description and objectives, your performance measurements, a timeline. How's this project getting funded? Because the RTO 9 is not going to fund the whole thing. So how else is it going to get funded? And this is where your revenue needs to match your expenses. And so there it is. This is the budget. This is what it's going to cost. And here's the financing, how it's going to be paid for. So these two numbers are going to have to match in the end. And there's your economic benefits and expected impacts. So you can give your TREM number in there. And your communication plan is really about how are you going to go about marketing and promoting this event and showcasing not only RTO 9, but the Ministry of Tourism, because the RTO 9s are funded by the Ministry of Tourism. So you're going to have to give recognition to both RTO 9 and the Ontario government. And then, explain how you're going to make sure that this project succeeds, and a checklist to make sure that you have supplied all the information that they're looking for. Well, it's one of the following. So you got to do one of these, right? You have to be either not-for-profit, which means that you are a corporation. If you're an actual not-for-profit, you were incorporated as such, so you'll have that number. Otherwise, you might also have a business number, and you might have Indian status. So yeah, as long as you're meeting one of those objectives. And this is just to help RTO 9 know whether you have participated in their program before. So all in all, as grants go, this is pretty straightforward. It's not too surprising. And it does give you a little bit of flexibility in the narrative, in terms of it's not a tight character count, but there is a space held within what they want to read. So less is more here. Okay. So we'll go back to this. Yeah, so what is important to RTO 9 is that you have, sorry, we'll step back for a minute. A partnership fund, these are funds that came to the RTOs separate from the operating costs of the RTO. or core dollars, as we call them. So the partnership fund is a separate allocation that the Ministry of Tourism has given to each of the RTOs, and it requires that matching dollars are met from the organization who are receiving partnership funds. And I say that loosely because when you apply for a partnership fund, the RTO 9 won't be giving you money, you'll actually be giving the RTO money. And so what happens is, because we're not allowed to flow through funds to our operators, we have to actually be seen as the lead for the project. And the ministry considers us being the lead if we're managing the finances. So what happens usually is that the operator will say, okay, here's the project, here's my partners who are going to help me with this project. It's going to cost $20,000. My contribution to that then, of course, is going to be $10,000. So the operator is going to give RTO 9 $10,000. It will match the $10,000 with the partnership fund. And then the project now has $20,000 in budget to expend. And all the bills have to go directly to RTO 9. You can't have the bills come to you as an operator, and then as the operator, you submit an invoice to RTO 9. That shouldn't happen. Now, sometimes I'm not privy to the nuances of RTO 9, but sometimes there's problems with that because, like, the operator has to pay for Facebook ads on their credit card. Well, there's no way around that. So as long as all the paperwork is there and you can prove as the operator, yes, I paid these Facebook ad bills with my credit card, and then get reimbursed for that, that's okay. The ministry doesn't mind that too much. We just want to avoid that kind of thing. So it's always better that if you're going to go and get printing material, that the invoice from that printer goes to RTO 9, not to the operator. And so RTO 9 is going to manage that $20,000 budget. You've contributed $10,000. Now we have $20,000 to use. So in this sense, it's not a grant. RTO 9 won't be giving you money. You'll actually be giving the RTO money, and they'll double it. And but that being said, yes, the RTO manages the money. It is most likely that the operator who came with the project will be the one who's managing the project, will fulfill all the requirements of that project, hire the staff, book the venues, get the whatever is needed for that project. The operator will deal with all the work involved and leave the financial matters in the hands of the RTO. So it's really important with this application that you meet the current priorities of RTO 9. Now, each RTO has pillars that they might talk about from the Ministry of Tourism, and these pillars are our governance, our marketing, our product development, investment attraction, and workforce development. And so everything that an RTO does falls in those pillars. But within that, every RTO, and it might be based on our current visitor tourism strategy or the annual business plan. But for now, the RTO 9's priorities are to support new events in your region, to help elevate new Indigenous tourism products. So product development essentially means experience development. What are the viable items, offers that a visitor can do to experience your region? And so it's not necessarily a thing, it's an experience. So when we talk about product development, that's really what we're talking about, is building an app for getting wayfinding signs. Well, that's their other one too, but a product development can be trail development, not necessarily an event, but maybe it's an experience floating down a river or at a farm or something like that, where they can do the farm to table experience with a chef. That is product development. So my caveat here, if you're not an Indigenous business, then if you want to go down the road of doing Indigenous tourism product development, you have to make sure that you are in collaboration and partnership with an Indigenous business that also has the same goals to see this project fulfilled. So as it said, Kevin from ITO will say nothing about us without us. So you just want to make sure that you're not trying to speak for a community that you don't belong to. Yeah, so and then their final priority is a guided experience or trails development, and that is wayfinding, signage, mapping. Maybe it's an app that digitizes the trails that you're developing. So these are the three priorities. So if you have a project that's going to fit these priorities, then go ahead and go to the effort of filling out their grant application, provided you meet their eligibility. You check those boxes in terms of incorporation and that kind of thing. So the RTO9 has produced a really nice, easy to follow instructions on how to fill out the application. And there are 9 steps to apply. And I think the first one is to become a partner with RTO9. Who are you? Do we know you? What are you about? And then you go through the steps to make that application. When they talk about SMART performance measurements, so these are it helps you kind of refine your performance measurements and into that quantitative element. So these performance measurements must be specific, right? You're really honing down. I want to see 5% increase on my website. It's measurable. I know what my base line is, and I know what an increase is going to look like, so I can measure that. Is it attainable? Is it realistic? Well, 5% should be. I think I can do that. And is it relevant? It doesn't matter that you want to see more traffic to your website. Well, if I have a new digital product on that website, then yes, that is important and timely. It's going to have a time frame. I'm going to want to see this 5% increase within 3 months, or you know, before the event starts, or whatever it is. But it has to have a time bound element to it. And so that's when they talk about a SMART performance measurements, that's what they're talking about. And it really just helps you make sure that the measurements that you're putting out are very concise and realistic is the main goal, and that you can measure them. That's why, you know, oh, I want to engage with Indigenous partners. Well, that's nice. How many? Who? How? Right? Like, you really have to be quite specific about doing the measurements, where the goal can be lofty or your vision can be lofty, but the measurements must be very specific. And then they're going to want you to outline the timeline, as you saw in the application. And it's very important to RTO9 that you're working with other entities, other organizations, other partners who are bringing something to the table to help you leverage resources, essentially, whether it's people, money, space. You know, maybe your partner can provide the park that you need. Maybe you have a nice relationship with the municipality and you get a deal on the police that are required to close the roads, whatever it is. So we need to know who the partners are, not necessarily co-applicants, but they're collaborators on the project, and they're going to help you succeed in your project. And then, of course, do the budget. And I have gone through TREM. So that will be used when you talk about the economic impact and benefits. Now, TREM will give you a nice number, you know, the 1.6 million, but what are the actual benefits to the community and its economy. And so those won't be numbered. They will be, well, we're getting volunteers from the community to help with this event. It's going to build pride of place. It's going to revitalize our little rural downtown. These are qualitative benefits. So beyond the dollar impact, what is the social impact? And so go down that road a little bit. And, I think a lot of it is intuitive, right? And maybe past experience or other people's experience of knowing what a good event does to a community. You just lay those all out. It shows a lot of these answers. The reviewer of this application will know these answers, but they want to see that you know them, that you're aware of the impact that your event can have on the community. And as I said, the communication plan is really about marketing. For RTO9, I don't know, Meg, you can correct me, but I would take it that if they do local marketing, that's okay. When you go into Experience Ontario, they won't fund any local marketing. They will only fund marketing that targets people from beyond 40 kilometers. So no brochures, no flags out front of your door, no lawn signs. They won't pay for any of that, but they will pay for your social media ads, for your billboard ads, for your print ads that go into magazines or online digitally. They really, of course, like digital marketing because you can track that. You can say so many people saw this ad. You can track that very easily, where you can't necessarily with the radio, but which is a shame because radio and billboard ads often have more of an impact. But as long as you say, okay, these radio ads are actually going to cover a space that is beyond 40 kilometers, then Experience Ontario will fund that. And so when you go into, just go down the little rabbit hole of Reconnect or Experience Ontario, when you want to say, sorry, kind of, how do I word this? Experience Ontario will want to make sure that you have to match their funding, right? So again, this is the matching dollar application or granting with Experience Ontario, and you have to match it with eligible expenses. So say you have a $20,000 project and 5,000 of it goes to local marketing and brochures, wayfinding, stuff that aren't eligible with Experience Ontario. So you really only have $15,000 that is eligible expenses. But you're going to still have to put up the other 5 to get the marketing that you need. You need those brochures, you need the wayfinding. So it's a bit of a dance on making sure that you're following the guidelines properly in those budgets forms for Reconnect, because they're going to have eligible costs, and they're going to break up those eligible costs between program expenses, administration, and marketing. And all the eligible costs can be matched by their dollars, but not the ineligible. So you might have to put in 15,000 and they're only going to match 10, or however the math works, right? So there are nuances with each and every one of these kind of grants. But it's really, you take one at a time, and they often, most granting bodies will say, come and talk to us. But certainly Trillium will provide sessions that you can go and talk to an advisor. The Ministry of Tourism has lots of advisors to ask questions about. And a lot of grants say, don't even apply until you talk to us. A lot of the federal grants, the building communities through arts and heritage, they won't let you submit a grant until you talk to somebody. So to make sure that you're not going to waste your time, you're not going to waste their time. Yeah, so that brings a close to my formal part of this presentation. So happy to answer any further questions.
I actually don't have any other questions so far.
Okay.
So far, no one else has said anything else.
A lot of information.
Yeah, a lot of information, a lot to take in, and it's also difficult. I know that if you're in the process of still looking for grants, it might be a little bit overwhelming because you're not really sure what questions to ask yet because you haven't found the one that you really want to go for.
Yeah.
So
I would say what I didn't mention, sorry, Meg, is that there's a lot of municipal grants as well. So start small. The RTO is extremely approachable, and you know, we run this partnership fund. I know you have an intake and you've got a formal process, but a lot of it is talking to Meg and asking what works. And then Meg can be a resource to your local municipality, because municipal grants will often actually cover operating costs and program costs. And so it really just takes some dedicated time to just do basic searches. And yeah, start locally and build your way up. Even if you start to get little grants, little micro grants from your BIA, you know, at least it gets you into the practice of doing this process. Yeah, work your way up to the big federal grants.
Exactly. And I was going to say, when it comes to the partnership fund opening window, I mean, we have a couple of weeks left, but I will say that while the window's open, I do get lots of phone calls, lots of emails asking questions, and you can send those anytime. It doesn't have to be specifically when the grant window is open. It can be if you have a question today, please feel free to contact me. My phone number and email is up on the RTO9 Partnership Fund page. So if you have questions about your project specifically, we do encourage people, just as Adrienne said, to reach out and have a conversation just to see if your project's even eligible, because we don't want you to go through the process if you're not going to be eligible at the end of the day, because as Adrienne said, these grants can take a good chunk of time to actually fill out. So ideally, get a little bit of the beginning stuff covered just to see if you're going to be eligible or not before going through the process of actually applying.
Yeah, and there are some bodies that always have grants. Trillium, I would look at FedDev Ontario. The FedDev represents Southern Ontario as opposed to FedDev NOR, which is Northern Ontario, but FedDev has recently got into the world of tourism development. And so they often have grants that will help with workforce development and product development. And then there's, yeah, that's why it's impossible to list them all because there are so many, but you just start to do Google searches and it'll lead you into certain places. And if you're really at such a loss, that organization, the Ontario Grant Watch, is, but it costs. You know, if you're looking for grant writers, I'm a grant writer, but there's grant writers out there who will be able to steer you in the right direction without you aimlessly looking at the internet.
So I don't have any other questions coming in, Adrienne. So
okay,
probably wrap up the session. And I will say that if anyone has any questions following this, you think of something in the next hour or two, please feel free to send it along. Adrienne has her email up there and her phone number if you have anything specific that she may be able to help you out with. And you can also always forward them along to me as well. But we'll give you 5 minutes back for your day.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Adrienne, so much for putting this together. It's incredibly valuable information for people to get started into grant writing.
Good. Well, it was useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you everyone for attending today. We do have a for-profit session next week, same time, same kind of format. It's going to be Adrienne presenting. She has a nice presentation for specific for-profit businesses, and we'll do the same thing with some Q&As. So if you are a for-profit business and you signed up for this one and you're interested, we do have that going on next week as well. But we'll give you your 5 minutes back. Enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you so much again, Adrienne, for putting this together.
All right, thank you, Meg.
All right, have a good day, everyone.